My talk today is focusing on an important new area in psychology, namely cognitive neuroscience. And what I hope to do is to provide an evaluation of cognitive neuroscience, focusing on its strengths and limitations. The first point to be made is that too many people, including many psychologists, are perhaps too impressed by cognitive neuroscience. And a few years ago, a British psychologist called Eysenck, he came up with the term to describe this excessive enthusiasm for cognitive neuroscience. He came up with the word neuroenchantment. And what he meant by that was, as it says on the slide, the pictures of blobs on brains seduce one into thinking we can now directly observe psychological processes. And of course that is not the case. I will be arguing that cognitive neuroscience, I think, is an increasingly important approach to understanding human cognition, but we need to be realistic about what it can achieve and what it can't achieve. So if we get some idea of just how impressed people are by cognitive neuroscience, here is just a recent study from last year where people indicated how impressed they were by different subjects in terms of their scientific rigor, their societal prestige, and the knowledge gap, the extent to which experts possess a lot more relevant knowledge than lay people. And as you can see on the slide, the natural sciences that a lot of people regard as being kind of as good as it gets in terms of scientific rigor and understanding, the natural sciences were on average given 8.71 score out of 10, whereas neuroscience was rated as more highly than that, 9.33. Even though I'm biased in favour of psychology, I'm a little bit surprised at the notion that neuroscience is significantly more rigorous scientifically than the natural sciences. And also, as you can see, cognitive neuroscience is rated as being a lot higher in terms of its value than psychology generally, which on the right-hand side only attracted a rating of approximately 7. So there's a big gap between the rating of 7 for psychology and the rating of over 9 for neuroscience. Right, and now we come on to another study that has looked at this issue about perhaps people becoming overly too impressed by the findings of cognitive neuroscience. What happened in this study was that the participants were provided with a description of a hypothetical study. Okay, so they either received this hypothetical study, just a description on its own, or there was the description plus accompanying brain images. So the brain images did not increase the validity of the study in any shape or form, but the researchers were interested in whether people reading about this hypothetical study, whether they would be more impressed if there were these brain images that were presented along with the article. And basically what they found, maybe it's not especially clear here, but what they found was that the brain images, particularly brain images that had a three-dimensional look about them, those brain images led the people taking part in the experiment to rate the scientific credibility of the research was rated significantly higher if you had an attractive three-dimensional picture of the brain to accompany it. Okay, so we have seen there is some tendency to exaggerate how important cognitive neuroscience is. We now come on to my favorite study in this area of trying to see the extent to which people exaggerate how important cognitive neuroscience is. Here we have the setup for a recent experiment published in 2014, and as I imagine you can see, it's a fairly primitive kind of setup, and in fact, if you look at the object above the participant's head, this is actually, as some of you may have recognized, this is actually a hairdryer, the sort of thing that you would find when you go to the hairdresser and have your hair done. Okay, so this is a mock scanner. This setup here could not possibly tell any researcher anything about what people are thinking. Okay, but what they did in this experiment, so this is the situation that the participants were in, and so the participants were given various tasks to carry out. Let's not worry about all of them, but for example, they were asked to write down a 3-digit number. They were asked to write down the name of a colour, simply that came to mind, and they were also asked to write down the name of a country, and they wrote down the answer, and they also thought about it while in this sort of pretend or mock scanner. Now, associated with this research project was a magician who managed to find a way of getting hold of the information the participants had written down without the participants being aware that this had happened. And so what happened was that the researchers claimed that they knew, using the equipment, they knew exactly what the participants had been thinking, that they knew exactly which 3-digit number the participants had thought of with the brain scanner using information from their brain activation. Purely on the basis of assessing brain activation, they could work out which 3-digit number the participants were thinking of, which colour they were thinking of, and which country they were thinking of. And amazingly, even though this would be obviously completely impossible, even if it were a genuine machine, in spite of that fact, as you can see at the bottom there, 3/4 of the participants believed in the paradigm, so they effectively believed that using the techniques of cognitive neuroscience, you can work out exactly what someone is thinking. So for me, this is a study that I like very much, because it provides the strongest evidence I know that people can grossly exaggerate what cognitive neuroscience can tell us about human cognition. Okay, well, one important, I'm now turning to some sort of more positive side of things. One of the useful contributions made by cognitive neuroscience is that it has helped us to some extent to understand how the brain is organized. Obviously, this is an incredibly complicated matter, and it is certainly arguable that the brain is one of the most complicated things that you can imagine. If we go back to the 19th century, during the 19th century, there was a lot of importance attached to phrenology. The basic idea was that if an expert sort of felt someone's brain and looked for sort of bumps indicating that someone had great ability in a particular area and so on, that one could understand what the brain was doing by feeling the outside of the brain. And as you can see in the slide there, different qualities such as perception, mental reasoning, and so on, these were all allegedly identified as occurring in specific parts of the brain. And of course, one might argue, well, what happens nowadays is that cognitive neuroscientists do something similar. So a few years ago, someone in my department, he was talking to me, and he said that perhaps we should think of cognitive neuroscience as being really similar to phrenology with magnets, that is to say, the magnets that are used in fMRI. Okay, so if we're trying to understand overall brain organization, two very important basic principles that are of direct relevance to brain organization. One is that it's obviously important. The principle of cost control is important. I think it's true that something like 20% of the energy used by humans every day is consumed by brain activity. So it's approximately 20% of all the energy costs that we incur are incurred by the brain. And so it's obviously important that our brains do not use up huge amounts of energy. It would make it very difficult for us if that were the case. Okay, so the principle of cost control is really important, but what is also really important is this second principle, the principle of efficiency. So in principle, you could argue that our brains would be maximally efficient if all the neurons in the brain were all completely interconnected with each other, so that communication was extremely rapid between any pair of neurons within the brain. There's at least one major problem with that sort of idea, and that is, as it indicates there, that we have something, probably different people have different estimates, but there are something like 100 billion neurons in the brain, and it has been estimated that if all these 100 billion neurons were interconnected, our brain would need to be 12.5 miles wide, which in European terms would be something, I suppose, approximating to 18 kilometers, something like that wide. Anyway, so we have the sort of a conflict here. Yes, it's clearly desirable that our brains, we have cost control, that we don't incur huge costs, But it's also important that our brains are efficient. We wouldn't be much good at thinking without a fair measure of efficiency. So what have cognitive neuroscientists discovered with respect to those two principles? Well, as I imagine you have guessed, on the left-hand side here we have what the brain would look like in terms of the connections if there were very good cost control but very little efficiency. So if our brains looked like the brain on the left there, everything would happen very, very slowly, because most bits of the brain are completely disconnected from other bits of the brain. So we would all think very slowly and probably very inaccurately as well. On the right-hand side, this is where we would have high efficiency, so there are lots of interconnections within the brain, but the problem is, of course, there would be high costs would be incurred with it. So on the left-hand side, we have the good news, we have low costs involved, but low efficiency. On the right-hand side, we have high efficiency, but with associated high costs. So, as you have probably all guessed, what is actually the case is the human brain is somewhere in the middle there. So our brains are constructed so that they are moderately efficient. There's a lot of interconnectivity, interconnections within the brain, and so this incurs moderate costs, but costs that we are able to cope with. So that, I would argue, that is one of the big contributions of cognitive neuroscience, that we have at a very general level, we have some understanding of how the brain is organized, and compared to the complete speculations associated with phrenology, here we have hard scientific evidence that confirms this sort of notion. Okay, but we can go a little bit further than that. I have already argued that the way the brain is organized is probably just about optimal, given the fact that we should not incur huge costs, and we want a good level of efficiency. There is one more point, and my apologies that this is a somewhat complex slide, but the basic idea is a simple one. And that is, okay, we have a brain that is organized so that there is a reasonable level of interconnections between different parts of the brain. But in addition to that, there are certain especially important parts of the brain that are have much more interconnections with other parts of the brain. So the brain is not homogeneous, the brain is quite heterogeneous in that there are a few bits of the brain that exhibit very high level of interconnections, whereas most of the brain only exhibits moderate interconnections with other parts within the brain. So, for example, up at these big red circles here indicate some brain areas that operate as hubs, as areas that are richly interconnected with other parts of the brain. So, as one would imagine, parts of the prefrontal cortex have rich interconnections with other parts of the brain. Okay, so we have a moderately complex system, and to maximize efficiency, we have a few parts of the brain that have very high interconnections with other bits of the brain. Okay, so what are the main limitations with cognitive neuroscience? Well, I've just drawn up a short list here, so I'll just briefly discuss each one in turn. So the purpose of this slide is simply to indicate to you the limitations that I'm going to be discussing in the next few minutes. Okay, now one of the problems with cognitive neuroscience that I think is an important problem, but one that has not, I think, received as much attention as it should have done, was identified a few years ago by an American psychologist, Utel. And basically what he did, it's a little bit complicated, but the basic idea is very simple. Okay, so what one finds more and more in cognitive neuroscience is there is so much research in cognitive neuroscience that, for example, one could ask, what are the brain areas involved in visual imagery, in attention, whatever cognitive function you might think of. And so you could look through the literature and you would probably find there might be 50 or 100 studies which had tried to identify the main brain areas associated with, for example, visual imagery. Right, cognitive neuroscience has now got to the point where for any given brain function, such as visual imagery, we now have there have been several different analyses based on combining the findings from many studies. These, of course, are called meta-analyses. And so Utel had the clever idea, supposing we take visual imagery, one person carries out a meta-analysis based on dozens of studies on visual imagery and concludes, here is a list of the brain areas involved in brain imagery. Someone else carries out a different meta-analysis, but also looking at visual imagery, and they also identify a list of the brain areas that seem to be involved in visual imagery. Now, of course, in an ideal world, if we compare the two lists of brain areas, we should find 100% agreement. That's in an ideal world, there would be 100% agreement. Sadly, as you can see, hopefully on the slide, the level of agreement varied depending on which cognitive function it was, varied between 14% and 53%. So what that means is that there is a lot more disagreement, a lot more inconsistency in the findings than one would like to see. Okay, but in spite of that problem, I would argue that this exaggerates the problems that we have. One simple reason why the agreement is not very high is because some researchers adopt more stringent criteria than others. So some researchers carrying out a meta-analysis, they insist that we have very significant or dramatic findings in order to say that a given brain area is involved in, say, visual imagery. Other researchers adopt a much more lenient criterion. So obviously, if someone adopts a very stringent criterion, they are going to identify many fewer brain areas than someone who adopts a very lenient criterion. Okay, and in addition, if we look at any of these meta-analyses, then often there is a lot of agreement on brain areas that are not involved in a given cognitive function. Okay, but nevertheless, there is a real issue here that it has proved more difficult to replicate findings in cognitive neuroscience than is desirable. Okay, so we then move on to another problem, and this was illustrated in what by now is quite a famous study, I think, by Bennett et al. In 2009. Okay, the participant, so it says here, an unresponsive participant was given the task of determining the emotions shown in pictures of people in social situations. Okay, and the findings are remarkable in a way. We can... Oh, that's up the wrong way. Oh, right. Yeah, it doesn't seem... Oh. Right, the findings are remarkable because this is a famous study now, because as you can see, the participant there has a slightly odd-looking brain. The participant in this study was actually a dead salmon that the researchers had bought at a local shop. But in spite of the fact that the participant didn't understand the task and was dead, nevertheless, in the experimental condition where the task was to identify emotions, there were one or two areas where there was significantly more brain activity when the task was being performed than when it wasn't. And you can see those two areas, the areas indicated by the red dots. Okay, so how can we explain this? This is obviously an absurd finding. So how can we explain this finding? Well, I think the answer, the message of this study is that very often in cognitive neuroscience, we collect huge amounts of data. We collect so much data that by chance alone, we would find plenty of apparent evidence for brain areas being importantly involved in whatever the task might be. In other words, if you collect a very large amount of data, there is a real problem of false positives. There's a very real danger that you will conclude incorrectly that a brain area is important, even when it isn't, because, for example, you've looked at 10,000 different very small brain areas and you found that some of them seem to be showing something. So that again is a problem. Right, then another tricky problem is that there's a big gap. There's a big gap between the sort of notions that we have in cognitive psychology, as it indicates here. In psychology, we identify processes such as reasoning, morality, attention, and so on. And what we would like to find is that there's a very neat sort of comparison possible. So we look at attention as psychologists, and we find particular areas that are activated, and these areas represent attention. The problem is that there is a huge divide, a huge gap between patterns of brain activity on the one hand and the sort of concepts and ideas that we have within psychology, and especially cognitive psychology on the other hand. So we have to try to believe that it will be possible to form strong links between our psychological ideas on the one hand and patterns of brain activity on the other hand, but it remains to be seen how far this is actually possible. Right, okay. I suppose one could argue, though, most cognitive neuroscientists are fairly realistic, I would argue. Not many people are so simple-minded that they imagine there'll be a nice, simple relationship between attention and patterns of brain activation, and so on. So I think there's a lot of realism, and so perhaps this is not necessarily a huge problem for cognitive neuroscience. Right, now a problem that used to be very common in cognitive neuroscience is what people sometimes used to describe as blobology. The sort of notion, as is illustrated here, there used to be far too many articles where people presented faces, presented other objects, and they looked in the brain, asked themselves which specific brain area is really active when people look at faces, process faces, but is much less active when people are not processing faces. So the emphasis was on localization of function, asking the question which specific bit of the brain is most involved in face processing. And as the name suggests, what people tended to conclude, several people did, was that the fusiform face area, that is where face processing occurs. Okay, we have now become wiser, and most people appreciate that any kind of complex processing is likely to involve much more than simply a single region. So a key development within cognitive neuroscience has been an emphasis on networks. The notion that if, for example, you are processing faces, then there's going to be a brain network that, sure, includes the face fusiform area, but includes lots of other areas. So on the screen here, we have, this is based on a meta-analysis of studies of face processing, and as you can see, there are several interconnected brain areas, all of which play an important role in face processing. So the old limitation of cognitive neuroscience, that it's very simple-minded to think face processing just uses one little bit of the brain, we now have a more sophisticated approach that revolves around networks. Right, okay, then one of the most important limitations of cognitive neuroscience concerns, backtrack a bit, nearly everyone nowadays accepts that cognitive neuroscience provides us with lots of valuable data about what is happening in the brain when someone is paying attention, when someone is engaged in visual imagery, when someone is reasoning, or whatever the task might be. However, many critics of cognitive neuroscience have argued that cognitive neuroscience has not been very successful at the theoretical level. A number of people have argued, indeed, that cognitive neuroscience, that simply studying patterns of brain activity is not going to tell us, not going to provide us with theoretically relevant information. And Max Coltart, who is one of the best known cognitive neuropsychologists, that is to say, he has devoted his career to studying brain-damaged patients. Coltart has argued strongly that cognitive neuroscience will always be useless in terms of having any real theoretical relevance. So, as you can see, hopefully, on the slide here, Coltart argues no facts about the activity of the brain could be used to confirm or refute some model of cognition. So that is a very definite, a very explicit statement saying that cognitive neuroscience is of no value theoretically. Okay, and there is a related point, and that is, to be honest, I mean, it surprises me. I have not read many articles or books that have made this point, but I actually think one could argue that the greatest limitation of all with cognitive neuroscience is that it has almost failed to lead to the generation, to the production of new theories. I would be delighted in the discussion after my talk if people have good examples that show that I'm wrong. I would be pleased, but my understanding is that so far cognitive neuroscience has generated remarkably few new theories. Nearly all research in cognitive neuroscience has made use of experimental paradigms and of theories in cognitive psychology that were developed some time ago. Yes, so cognitive neuroscientists generally place a lot of reliance on pre-existing theories and very rarely produce new theories of their own. But I say I would be very interested if people have good examples to show that's wrong. Right, okay. Well, in a short talk like this, I don't have time to go too much into the issue about cognitive neuroscience and whether it has successfully tested theoretical ideas. So what I will do is just fairly briefly to discuss two examples where I personally think that cognitive neuroscience has proved valuable in terms of testing theories. So, in other words, I actually think Coltart, I think he's quite wrong. I think it is quite wrong to say that cognitive neuroscience cannot be used successfully to test theories. Okay, well, just very briefly, if we go back, as you can see from the dates there, if we go back, what, about 30 years? If we go back about 30 years, there have been a number of theories about consciousness that are fairly similar in essence. And the basic ideas sound very plausible. The basic idea is, supposing we take the example of visual perception. Okay, so we present a face or other visual stimulus to our participants, and it will take some time for them to have conscious perception of the face in front of them. So, what processes occur? Obviously, some processes occur before consciousness, and then there must be other processes that are more directly associated with consciousness. So, what do these processes look like? Excuse me. A popular theoretical view has been that below the conscious level there are a number of very specific processes occurring. So colour is processed in one part of the brain, shape is processed in a different part of the brain, motion in a third part of the brain, and so on. So the idea is that specific little bits of the brain are working more or less independently. So the key word really on the slide there is independently. So the different brain areas have very little connections between them while processing is occurring below the conscious level. Okay, then at some point what happens is that there is synchronized processing, that processing in different parts of the brain, it stops being independent and it becomes synchronized. So the interconnections across different parts of the brain become considerably stronger, and it has been argued that it is this integration of brain processes all occurring at the same time, this integrated processing, this is what produces conscious awareness. Now, the interesting thing is this theory was put forward, as I say, approximately 30 years ago, and I imagine similar ideas had been put forward 40, 50 years ago. The interesting thing is that until approximately 10 years ago, there was no research of direct relevance to this theory. And I would argue that if one just focused on behaviour, it would be very difficult to prove that this theory is correct, just using behavioural measures of accuracy and reaction time and so on. It'd be very difficult. Whereas in principle, it is relatively easy to test this theory by making use of cognitive neuroscience. So I move on to what is one of my favourite studies in cognitive neuroscience. This was a study, as I said, about 10 years ago. This is 2007, so almost 10 years ago. What happened was that visual stimuli were presented. They were presented very rapidly. They were very hard to perceive. And what happened was they were presented in such a way that some of the time the participants said, yes, I can see I can see what the visual stimulus is, but on other trials, they said, no, I'm sorry, I couldn't see what the visual stimulus was. Okay, so we have the same stimulus being presented, but it is sometimes associated with conscious experience, and sometimes it is not associated with conscious experience. And so what Maloney et al. Did in their study, so what we have here, this is a pity, unfortunately, I'll just double check, the pointers doesn't seem to work on this. No, it's not. Okay, I'll just work through this. This is actually more simple than it may look. Across the top there we have, that is the condition in which the participant said, yes, I have a conscious experience of the stimulus that's being presented. The 4 pictures of the brain along the bottom, that is the condition in which the participant said, I'm sorry, I was not able to see what stimulus was being presented. Okay, and as we move from left to right, on the first pictures on the left-hand side, that indicates brain connections before the stimulus had been presented. Then the second one indicates very, very soon after the stimulus had been presented. The crucial one, the third pictures along, that is between 40 and 182 milliseconds after the stimulus had been presented. And then the fourth one is between 182 and 333 milliseconds. What is of crucial importance here are these black lines. The black lines indicate synchronized activity across the 2 bits of the brain that are connected by a black line. So, as you can see, in the condition associated with conscious awareness, as you can see, starting with the third picture along, you can see that there is a substantial amount of synchronized brain activity associated with conscious experience. And that is true to a lesser extent in the fourth picture. Whereas, as you can see, the crucial comparison is if we look at the condition with no conscious perception, as you can see, there are far, far fewer synchronized activities, far less synchronized activity across different brain areas. Okay, so this provides, for me, provides quite strong evidence indicating the importance of synchronized brain activity as being involved in conscious awareness. And so this, for me, definitely helps to test the theory that we started with. Okay. And here, this is, in a way, is a similar study, but just showing the findings rather differently. Here we had a study where similarly visual stimuli were presented, and the participants were either consciously aware of what stimulus had been presented, or they were not consciously aware of what had been presented. And what we have here is, as you can see, it's a sort of subtractive logic. So what they did was they looked at functional connectivity, synchronized activity across the brain when there was conscious awareness, and they subtracted from it any evidence of synchronized activity across the brain when there was no conscious awareness. And as you can see, just glancing at this, As you can see, you look up towards the sort of more the yellow areas within the figure. As you can see, very large areas of the brain showed substantially more synchronized activity when there was conscious awareness than when there was not. Okay, so I would like to argue that cognitive neuroscience has provided more relevant evidence to testing the theory we started with than is the case with previous behavioral experiments. Okay, I'll then come on to my second example is as follows. Okay, so let us take what has been an important theoretical controversy within the area of language or speech perception. Okay. Now, supposing you listen, someone presents a sentence to you auditorily. You listen to a sentence that is presented. Now, the sentence has been deliberately sort of blurred and distorted, so you really have to struggle to understand the sentence. Okay, so that's the starting point. Auditory presentation of a sentence, but the sentence is distorted, so you can just about understand what it is, but it is really difficult to understand. Okay, now a very obvious finding in this area that was found 20, 30, 40 years ago is if you provide, it's completely unsurprising, if you provide appropriate visual context, people find it much easier. So I present a sentence, you're struggling to understand what it is. If I present to you at the same time, visually, the sentence that you're listening to, you think, this is easy. Yeah. But you feel that it is easier to hear the sentence, okay? So that's what we're talking about here. So no one is surprised that if you have the strong visual context, it makes speech perception much easier. But a major theoretical controversy has lasted for 20 or 30 years, and that is, how do we explain this? It's obvious that you'd expect strong context to help you to understand things. But there are two possibilities. One is that the normal auditory speech processing occurs, and when it comes to an end, you use your knowledge acquired from the visual sentence, you use that information to make sense of the auditory processing that has occurred. Okay, so the first notion is all the usual auditory processing occurs, but then afterwards you think, of course that fits with the visual sentence. Another possibility is that the visual context very rapidly facilitates auditory processing. So the second account says that the visual context almost immediately influences the auditory processing, not just more generally making sense of the sentence, but that the visual context facilitates auditory processing early on, rather than simply using the information from the visually presented sentence to make sense afterwards. So you get the general idea. So the crucial theoretical issue is, does the visual context influence early auditory processing or not? The first theory there, number one, says no, it doesn't influence auditory processing as such. The second theory says yes, it does. Okay, so here we have, in principle, a nice, clear theoretical contrast between the two. Okay, so, listen, okay. So, Wild et al. 4 years ago in 2012, they carried out a study exactly along the lines that I have just been describing. So we have a spoken sentence such as the car drove over the cliff, but presented so that you would really find it hard to understand. And it was presented either, the visual context was either the same sentence or without a sentence, or with a different sentence. Okay, but the crucial condition is where you have the same sentence is presented at the same time as the auditory sentence. And the crucial finding was that what they found was that when you had the strong visual context, there was much more activity in primary auditory context than when you did not have that visual context. So in other words, which is not so obvious, when you present a useful sentence visually, it has a direct and almost immediate impact on auditory processing. It's not just that you find it easier to understand the sentence, but an important reason why you find it easier to understand the sentence is because early auditory processing is being facilitated by a purely visual input. Okay, so this, I would almost go so far as to say that this, in my opinion, this is about as impressive a finding as I can think of in terms of using cognitive neuroscience to test a pre-existing theory. Here we have speech perception, we have, I'm not sure how many, but possibly 200 or 300 behavioural experiments have been carried out to decide whether context has an early or a late influence on speech perception, and most people felt the controversy had not been resolved. Some findings suggested early influence of context, some findings suggested late influence of context, but none of the findings were very clear. In my opinion, this finding here is the strongest and clearest finding suggesting that context can have a very rapid and important impact on speech processing. Right, okay, let me just see. Okay. Okay, well, I think I will leave out those. Okay. Right, then finally we come to a difficult issue. You may remember that I was pointing out that my opinion is that cognitive neuroscience has very rarely led to the generation of any new theories. So, for example, the studies on conscious awareness and on speech perception, these studies were based upon pre-existing theories that had existed for a long time. But if cognitive neuroscience is to be really valuable, one would hope at some point that cognitive neuroscientists would be able to start generating new theories that, in other words, the findings obtained from patterns of brain activity would allow us to develop new ways of looking at human cognition. Now, I would be the first to admit we are a long, so don't get me wrong, we are a long, long way, I think, from having done that. But for me, the most interesting approach is one based along the following lines. Okay, if you take cognitive psychology, most of us, we have the idea that cognitive psychology, we should divide it up into small topics. So some people look at attention, or some people look at visual attention, some people look at auditory attention. We all tend to look at fairly specific topics within cognitive psychology. And we also perhaps tend to feel that social psychology is very different. Social psychology is not something that cognitive psychologists should be looking at, and so on. So, in other words, we tend to divide psychology up into very specific little topics. I may be oversimplifying a bit, but I think most people spend most of their time thinking of psychology as involving quite narrow or specific topics. Okay, but then if we look at cognitive neuroscience, then we find that there are exciting developments in terms of finding that there are a fairly small number of really important brain networks, and a few possible examples are given on the slide there. Let us not worry about the detail, but just accept the general idea that cognitive neuroscientists are increasingly identifying very general processing networks, large-scale brain networks. But what is especially exciting about that, and my apologies if it's not very visible on the next slide, a study a few years ago sort of went through the literature, and basically what they found, as I say, it's a little hard to see this, but what they found was, if you look in the top left there, the executive network, I'll just focus on that one, which is associated with goal-directed processing and monitoring. What they found is, if we start with the light blue at the top there, that they looked through a huge number of studies. So as you can see, there were quite a number of studies on emotion where the executive network was involved, studies on attention, cognition, imagination, language, memory, motor processing, perception, and visual processing. Okay, so in other words, they found that the executive network was involved in a very wide range. It looked like the same network was involved in a wide range of different sorts of processes. And they found other brain networks seemed to be involved in on cognitive tasks, but also on various social tasks and other kinds of tasks. Okay, so the idea that I find exciting is the notion that maybe we should spend a bit more time sort of thinking about this notion that maybe there is a manageable number of brain processing networks that are used across a very wide range of situations, and that maybe at some point in the future, theories based upon these networks may prove to provide a different perspective on our understanding of human cognition to those that we have had in the past. Now, all of that is some way in the future. Okay, well, since my time is almost up, I'm moving on to my final slide, which gives you a few conclusions. Maybe I might, just before I start on the first one there, some of you may know I have produced a very large textbook in cognitive psychology, for which the 7th edition was published last year. And so for me, and it appears every 5 years, this textbook. So one of the interesting things for me is to see. So every 5 years I get to see what changes have occurred in cognitive neuroscience. So my first conclusion relates to some of the major changes, it seems to me, that all good changes that have happened in cognitive neuroscience in recent time. In the 2005 edition of my handbook, there was too much, in fact, most of the research was based upon blobology. Most of the research was based on the notion face processing, which little bit of the brain is most active when people do face processing or any other kind of processing, which is the single brain area most involved, which I think is a very, very limited approach. And as it says there, little theory. There were very few attempts even to test theories. People just seemed to be excited that they could discover these patterns of brain activity without worrying about theory. Okay, then the next edition of my handbook, the 6th edition in 2010, there was still quite an emphasis on blobology, on specific brain areas, but there was a bit more emphasis on testing theory. And then the most recent edition of the handbook, I feel there's been a lot of progress because the emphasis is now much more realistically on brain networks rather than on specific brain areas. And there's been a dramatic increase in attempts to test theories thoroughly in a way that just hardly happened 10 years ago. Right, then another conclusion I would make is one of the great advantages, I think, of cognitive neuroscience is that it is potentially self-correcting. So, for example, what we could do, and some people do, is you could go back over previous studies. So supposing you had a study that was carried out 10 years ago, and the researchers said, what we have found is that face processing is all about the fusiform face area. If the researchers have kept the data, it would be possible, in principle, to reanalyze the data with what we now know that face processing involves brain networks. So we could take the very same data and perhaps very usefully find that there was much more useful information in the data than the researchers imagined 10 years ago when they just focused on one specific brain area. So you take the general point that in studies of fMRI, we typically collect such a huge amount of data that, as some of you will have discovered, sometimes the main problem is to know which particular analyses to carry out. There is so much data, it would be impossible to analyze the data in all ways possible. So as our theoretical understanding increases, so we can go back over our data and reanalyze them and perhaps extract more useful information from them. Okay, well then, yes, the next point, I mean, perhaps something that is related to that, and that is with behavioral experiments, we know how long it takes someone to perform a task. So, for example, with visual perception, we can find out, we present a sort of a blurred picture of a face, and we can see how long it takes someone to have a conscious perception of that face. So we have a measure of reaction time. But reaction time does not tell us anything, as far as I can see. But reaction time will not tell us anything about this notion that initially the independent processes going on in different bits of the brain and then the synchronized processing. Reaction time is just a very general measure. Reaction time simply tells us, if you like, reaction time says we've no idea what went on in the brain, but what we do know is it took 450 milliseconds for whatever did happen to happen. But you see, that is clearly very limited information. It is useful to know how long it takes to see a blurred visual image, but clearly it's limited theoretically in terms of what was happening during the time before the person responded. Okay, then, as I was trying to indicate at the end, I think more than has been appreciated, cognitive neuroscience has applicability throughout psychology, that these things like the executive network and the salience network and so on, in principle, it seems probable that these networks, which are very important within cognitive psychology, are also probably very important within social psychology, developmental psychology, and so on. So I think an exciting development in the future will be extending the range of cognitive neuroscience to these other areas. So move it away from simply cognitive psychology and move it off into these other areas. And as I've indicated, just if I can summon up the energy and motivation to produce an 8th edition of my Handbook of Cognitive Psychology, then what I'm hoping I'm going to be able to put into the book is that there are, by that time, hopefully, a few theories within cognitive neuroscience where the theory has been generated via evidence about patterns of brain activity, that it is not just research based on pre-existing theories in cognitive psychology, but is genuinely cognitive neuroscience theory produced directly as a result of research findings in neuroscience. Anyway, I think I've talked a bit longer than was the intention, so I thank you very much for listening so patiently. Thank you. Thank you.
У нас, к сожалению, вот минут 15-20 на вопросы, но я сразу приглашаю всех, кому интересно еще пообщаться и обсудить проблемы, которыми занимается Майкл. В субботу в 10 часов 4-й корпус нашего университета, 022 аудитории, там у нас будет больше времени, поскольку каждое мероприятие дня рождения университета расписано не просто по часам, а буквально по минутам. Пожалуйста, давайте приступим к вопросам. Да, пожалуйста. Да, включи.
Уважаемый Майкл, очень интересный содержательный доклад. Скажите, пожалуйста, правильно ли я понимаю, что ваши основные исследования, о которых вы рассказывали, базируются и соприкасаются с исследованиями российского ученого, в частности, Александра Ивановича Лубина?
Some of my research does relate to that research, but my talk was a more general one, really, just talking about general findings rather than my own specific research. My own specific research I will be talking about more in 2 days' time.
Пожалуйста, еще кто-то хочет спросить?
Dear Michael, can I ask you about your opinion about comparison results of experiments in animals and in humans, results which obtained not about basic functions, like dopamine receptors or something like that, but in higher functions, emotions or perceptions. Is it really useful, or that is something not so useful for understanding us as human?
Okay. there's no simple answer to that, but I suppose my position would be somewhere in the middle. So if we take if we take emotions, you mentioned emotions. If we consider emotions, then I am very willing to accept that there is a large overlap in terms of the basic physiological, biological processes, emotional processes in humans and in many other species. Yeah, so it is worthwhile studying other species in order to understand emotions in humans, but for me, I think there are two important limitations to that. One is that, perhaps to oversimplify a little bit, emotions in other species tend, for the most part, to relate to what is currently happening, right? So a big difference is, in humans, some of our emotions can refer to things that happened a long time ago. So we can experience the emotion of depression by thinking about the loss of someone who was very important in our lives, who died 5, 10, 15 years ago. But I don't think other species, their emotions are not triggered by events that happened a long time ago. And similarly, humans can experience anxiety. If a student has a very important examination in 2 weeks' time, they may become very anxious because of their future orientation. And again, I don't think animals spend much time thinking about what will happen to them in 1 week or 2 weeks. So there's that point. The other point is, I would argue that complex emotions in humans are not found in other animals, possibly to some extent. But some of our more complex emotions, such as shame and guilt, possibly some species so small elements of that. But emotions that relate to how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive our own value, and so on. I would not imagine that most other species, I wouldn't imagine their emotions tend to revolve about how they perceive their own personal value. So I think there is quite a lot of overlap between emotion in other species and in humans, but in addition, there are several unique features of human emotions. So I'd say my answer is a kind of a compromise one. There is value in studying emotions in other species, but to fully understand emotion in humans, I think we have to study humans as well to understand the greater complexity of human emotions.
Пожалуйста. Еще есть у нас возможность на вопросы, да. Ну, тогда, если вы позволите, мы еще раз поблагодарим Майкла Айзенка, ему хорошего дня, сегодня очень много мероприятий, а нам всем тоже я желаю успехов, продвижения, в том числе различных научных наших исследований. Спасибо большое.